For everyone with an interest in NASH, or more broadly, fatty liver disease, Surf's Up, Season 3, Episode 29. Our special rebroadcast of today's closing panel at International NASH Day starts now.
Welcome to our rebroadcast of today's International NASH Day closing panel. And now, a special introduction from Roger.
Hi, it's Roger Green. Well, the 5th International NASH Day is now a piece of history. What a fantastic day. Almost 6 hours of inspiring and educational panels posted by GLI, supported by countless programs from partner organizations around the world. Every year, this day just gets bigger and bigger and much better. As I mentioned on our preview episode yesterday, the Global Liver Institute invited Jorn, Louise, and me to serve as the panel for the Wrapup session, moderated by GLI Director of NASH Programs, Jeff McIntyre. We all really enjoyed the session. Even more fun for Louise and me were the side discussions we had in the GLI chat room with attendees during both airings of the panel. For those who missed it, or simply want an audio history of our panel, we're posting the full panel tonight, and we'll post two 12 to 15 minute sections among our conversations this weekend. Before we start, the entire SurfingNASH team wants to congratulate GLI on its tremendously successful event, to thank Donna Cryer and Jeff for inviting us to participate, and to thank Kat Evans and Christine Maloof for being so talented, professional, and generally a delight to work with. And here's our panel.
Hi, I'm Jeff McIntyre, the Director of NASH Programs at the Global Liver Institute, the world's largest liver patient organization. We bring together more than 200 organizations across our councils, campaigns, and events to advance liver health as public health, to both prevent liver diseases and scale optimal approaches to improving the lives of individuals and families impacted by liver disease. On today's concluding panel for International NASH Day, I am happy and honored to be joined by the team from the Surfing the NASH Tsunami podcast for a review of the issues and a breakdown of the day. Joining me is Louise Campbell, the founder and medical director of Talazun Health, Roger Green, our CEO of SurfingNASH.com, and you know him as the executive producer and host of Surfing the NASH Tsunami podcast, and Jorn Schattenberg, professor of medicine and director of the Metabolic Liver Research Program at the University Medical Center Mainz in Mainz, Germany. And I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. I should just say Frankfurt, Jorn. Jorn, I know that's probably slander, but I appreciate you joining us today as well.
Glad to be here. Thank you. I have to highlight that this is a different federal state, so you crossed the border by placing me into Frankfurt.
Oof, I do apologize for that. That's an important distinction there.
And Jeff, if it had been me, Jorn would have reminded me that BioNTech of Pfizer-BioNTech is in Mainz, not in Frankfurt.
Got it.
So I'm getting a plug for your university, Jorn.
I want to thank you guys for coming in. I know you've had discussions and y'all regularly have discussions around Surfing NASH Tsunami, which really kind of leads the conversation around fatty liver disease and NASH. One of the things that I wanted to start off the conversation with y'all on, and Roger, let me start with you as the host of Surfing the NASH Tsunami, is do you think that there's anything that sets International NASH Day apart from the other events that happen around it? You know, originally this was kind of a corporate event that GLI took over. And for a while, it used to be kind of the state of NASH event, if you will, with a list of panels. But now we're in such a crowded environment with, there's NASH there's Liver Connect, there's the International Conference on Fatty Liver Disease in Vienna, there's Paris NASH. There's the NASH Summit. Y'all just did the event that I spoke at in London. Jorn, you were part of the event in Barcelona as well. It seems to me that it's become a very crowded field. What do you feel like is kind of the benefit of International NASH Day?
Well, so it's interesting because we started our preview podcast by talking about how we view this as the day. Really, the day of the year when the community should sit and take stock and say, okay, where have we been over the past year? And the reason is that every event you describe is fundamentally physician focused. Now, it may be broader than that, but it all starts with doctors. And International NASH Day has always been the event that started with patients. And Jorn was positively compelling on this on our podcast, but the patients are the reason that this has to get done.
Mm-hmm.
the patients with cirrhosis, the increasing numbers. That's why this has to happen. So International NASH Day becomes the day in our mind for us to take stock and say, okay, what did we get right in the last year? What do we have to do in the next year? And what are some of the exciting things that we're seeing evolve as a result of the efforts of GLI and other, well, really GLI and other organizations like that?
Louise, let me go to you with the question on this too, because on the perhaps one of the recent Surfing the NASH Tsunami episodes, when we were covering the International Congress on International Liver, make sure I get this right, the Global NASH Congress. One of the remarks that you made was how you were happy not just for there to be kind of a corporate involvement, that there were industry speakers, that usually doesn't happen there, but also Marco and I from ELPA and GLI were speaking as well. Would you consider that to be a positive, and International NASH Day kind of representing a step forward for that?
Absolutely. I think Donna has said many times, everything starts with a patient and ends with a patient. And I think what I was excited to see in the Global NASH Summit was the actual now involvement of yourself and Marco and this more diverse conversation that went on. It's not only about drug development. It's not only about mice models. It really is about how we can develop from here and transition through a clinical trial program and use patients' data in the best way. And also the best people to tell you what they need. And Jose was very strong on this in Barcelona, is the patients will tell you what they need. We tend to presume in healthcare, we want to deliver what we think they need. And there is a mass difference. And I think the Global NASH Day for me is about getting that message out there. This year you have over 200 partners. Your session with the patient advocates was key, and they brought up something that we don't talk a lot about, is that NASH is not just a person-centric disease. It affects the entire family, the caregivers. The minute you get somebody diagnosed with NAFL or NASH or cirrhosis, it affects everybody around them, the quality of life of the whole family. If you've got to go to hospitals, if you've got to go to these other areas, if you've got a dementia in the family that's vascular related to fatty liver disease or coronary disease or type 2 diabetes, it is a global disease for that person and that whole family. And I think this is what International NASH Day brings. It brings all of the elements for me to that.
Jorn, I'm going to come to you with this question as well about kind of the role of the patient and the importance of International NASH Day and the work that you do around fatty liver disease, and especially coming off of the Barcelona conference that you were so intimately involved with as well. And I know Donna, our CEO, was there. I wonder if you could just kind of reflect on the patient voice kind of in light of International NASH Day and the work that you're doing as well.
Yes, and thanks again, Jeff, for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be on here. The program in Barcelona really highlighted that the urgent need to get everybody to the same table and define the way forward, the next steps in caring for patients with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is right around the corner. And Donna gave a brilliant insight into all the work that GLI has been building on that, really reaching out globally and getting together so many partners that we're able to speak from so different systems about what a patient perspective is, and of course how patients can help to drive that process. That at one side has drug development and scientific aspects around. We talked about NITs here during NASH Day and drug development pipelines, but it has to come to the patient. And the question is, where are the patients? What do they need? And how can we involve them? And if I can reflect a little bit on International NASH, actually my first point of contact or experience was that International NASH Day put me into a position that I pulled up a little booth in the middle of a German mall and handed out flyers, started talking to people about liver disease. And I think this is so much International NASH Day for me, involving getting to talk to to outside of my peers, outside of science, talk to the patients, maybe the population that doesn't know about liver disease. Do I have 2 of that? Is a common question, and where is it? And does it hurt? And these type of activities, I think, they're so crucially linked to International NASH Day, and as such, I applaud you for continuing the leadership, bringing this forward, and I'm happy to be here.
So let me throw this more open to the 3 of you. Then, when we think about the patient voice specifically, I've got a couple of different metaphors or analogies that come to mind. But when we think of the patient voice, what are the areas of the field of fatty liver disease and NASH do you feel like it's most important for patients to be involved with right now as we are in kind of the evolution of the stage? Is it protocol review? Is it clinical trial design? Is it drug approval? Is it prevention and education? Where do you feel like the most pivotal place for patients to be involved is right now?
So is yes an appropriate answer to that question? Let me give you an example that struck me that it isn't something you would normally think about, but being patient-centered changes things. So at 5th Global NASH last month, Becky Tabb was presenting magical work, and one of the things she talked about was liver volume. Right. And liver volume sounds like an artifact. It's not related to liver fat directly. It's not related to the metabolic consequences. But as Jorn pointed out on podcast, it is related to upper right quadrant pain. So if you let the scientists and the mice people run that exercise, you'll never get the perspective that goes, that's a real quality of life measure of import. And for that, the reason I said yes is that the patient's perspective is so unique and so important given the complexity of the disease that it will take different touches everywhere along the line, but everywhere along the line it's going to matter tremendously.
Yeah, that's interesting. Her conversation with Rachel, I thought, was really interesting. And the theme of liver volume coming out versus, say, ballooning or the other aspects of liver disease was a really fascinating sort of point to make on that, which I think will lead to some interesting clarifications going down the road. I could go into that rabbit hole pretty deeply after the conversation y'all had on that. Louise, Jorn, let me throw it to you guys in terms of if you had to prioritize where patient voice might be the most prioritized right now from your perspective, where would that be?
I think for me, there's 2 sides to that question. One is where they need to be, which is up front and center, talking about non-invasive diagnostics, getting into clinical trials. We know that people in trials get better care because they're in a different type of pathway, and they're getting more attention. So I think if you've been diagnosed, try and talk and get into that conversation about where are the trials? How do I participate in them? What can I do to help? Because when you help a trial, you help yourself. And I think that's key. And also you drive the movement forward. So there is that altruistic side. But I think what's lacking is patient education and awareness of just how important the liver is. I think, again, going back to the patient advocates session, if there's a lack of education, there's a need for patients to drive advocacy. If education is up and key and really good, then less people feel that need because they're obviously being catered for. So I think by addressing that within healthcare ourselves, we need to talk a language that educates. We need to talk a language that locates. We need to talk a language that actually doesn't stigmatize, that's throughout all of our disciplines, whether it's endocrinology, cardiology, all of those. We need to be talking about how we help our bodies function better. That can be done without stigma, but I think certainly driving the education. And I agree with you on the amount of times I've said, oh, have I got 2? I didn't know it was there. You could go back to school education. If you don't know, come out of education knowing that normal physiology of the body, not necessarily techno, but where things are. Most people can put their hand on their heart. So education is key for me. We can start it young, and it's a cheap form of healthcare because prevention is better than cure, and education helps prevention.
That leads to your remark, Jorn, that you've also made about how people will ask if you have two of them. By implication, I've also seen conversations where people have thought, well, I can live without it, if you will. If there's two, then it's like the kidneys, you can get by with just one or so. Is that the most prominent priority right now for the patient voice, you think, in the field, is building that awareness and education, or is there something on the development or clinical trial side you would see as a priority?
Yeah, so my disclosure here, Jeff, is of course that I'm a physician talking about thinking what patients want. And, from the whole discussions with patient advocacy, I realized that this is pretty, influenced by my expectations of what a patient should want, maybe. So taking a step back, and I think what Louise said resonated nicely with me, is the education about the disease. Now, we should not over stigmatize or make patients too nervous about disease, because the majority of them has fatty liver, which is a condition that puts them in an at-risk category for future metabolic diseases, or down the line, maybe even a liver disease, but nothing they're going to drop dead off tomorrow. Still, I have patients being afraid of their GGT values sitting in front of me and not realizing that their highest risk of developing stroke or cardiovascular disease is more imminent. So I think to give a perspective on the dynamics of liver disease, the liver as a mirror of metabolic health, educating them on, there's time, there's room to change things, educate them on this. But then there's, of course, the patients we really want to identify, because they're being taken care in a diabetic clinic, and we want to empower them to realize that they have compensated cirrhosis, and nobody has ever looked at their liver prior to this. So it's a wide spectrum. I think the patient empowerment, being able to do something for themselves at this point in prevention or lifestyle aspects, is critical. They're not so intimately into the clinical trial field. I think I don't see that as the most urgent at this time.
Let me stick with you for our next question, then, Jorn, as well. We'll go around. I want to kind of dive into this issue around clinical care models, which I know you've been very involved with, and we just had a great panel, arguably one of our best panels on clinical care, models of clinical care as part of International NASH Day. We see in these clinical care models that are beginning to emerge, they're emerging in different areas. The AGA's got their care model. You guys came up with a care model. We're beginning to see them kind of pop up in different areas. And we know that the point of engagement for patients sometimes is different. Sometimes it's primary care. Sometimes it's a little further down the line as well. I'm curious as to where the common threads in this. We're beginning to see enough of these clinical care models. I'm wondering if there was a way that we could kind of push out of best practices, or I guess what I'm saying is, where's the patient in all of these clinical care models? Would there be something that is not necessarily a clinical care model, but perhaps what would a patient care model or a patient pathway look like?
Good point and question, Jeff. In the end, we're going to have a diverse set of clinical care models which have to adapt to the system they're running. I think this is the most important aspect, is that a clinical care model has to be accessible for the patient. That's what you're asking me, and it has to be financed and accepted by the local authorities, the physicians, and as such, there is no good way to have an overarching worldwide clinical care model. I think there are certain aspects that are important, and patient-centric is that they should have access or be able to talk to someone. Now, this could be a physician assistant, a nurse, a nutritionist in a first step, because they're afraid of their liver disease, or they should be approached by a physician because they fall into a risk category and say, you have diabetes. Have you had a test for liver disease? And in an ideal world, the physician would already know this. And this would then trigger certain subsequent testings that are likely going to be very different in different systems. In the end, they can't, we don't have the resources to spend a lot of money on testing in many patients. So they have to be risk stratified and stepwise, incremental in terms of ruling out patients with severe disease, then enriching the at-risk population and ruling in with then specialist care. I think that's bottom line what it is. It will be in most scenarios a three-step procedure and accessibility for the patient or if he's not caring enough to look at that, it's important to identify the patients at risk, which we as a scientific community need to define. And I think there's been a lot of advancement in that field recently.
Louise, you mentioned caregivers just a few minutes and about kind of addressing the holistic aspect of a patient as well. If we were to think of this, the clinical care models that we have, and that they're being kind of an overlaying patient pathway as well, are there aspects of what a patient pathway has that the clinical care models may not speak to or have not spoken to yet?
I think that's tough because I really don't think we've defined what the clinical care model is. I think, as Jean said, a different clinical care model in a remote country in Africa will be different to a clinical care model in the NHS, for example. I think there's a basic skeleton, I think, that we could put together, that all patients get seen and assessed, as Jean said, whether it is by a nutritionist, whether it's by a nurse. It's that first point of contact where you're looking at the risk factors. Now, I think they use the term care navigator, and I think there was some discussion around that term. And I think, from my perspective, obviously being a nurse is often the first person that the patient goes to. It's the first port of contact. It's the first person the doctor will go to ask about the patient. So for me, that's logically somebody who is a nurse. We have cardiac nurses, we have endocrine nurses, we have rheumatology nurses, because remember, they deal with poor liver health with methotrexate and fatty liver disease. There are cancer nurses who deal with tamoxifen, and women postmenopausal on these medications are a growing risk factor for liver transplantation. So I think it is about that understanding of risk factors, and can that be done by one person? Probably yes, before you lead into the skeleton and you enrich the population by ruling out severe disease and concentrate on education and metabolic risk factors and how we avoid and reduce that risk, and how we really enrich our liver education. For me, my strength is liver education and that side, but I would be able to discuss a little bit on the other sides. So that for me is, if we can put a skeleton together, which we can then enrich in each of the populations. There's no point talking about Mediterranean diet in the middle of Southeast Asia, where rice or noodles or a different diet is there. So you need to be able to dip in and dip out. So rather like the body, we have the skeleton of the program, and each area fills in the tissue around that program. I think that's where I see it more, but I don't think we've defined what our outcomes are or where our multimorbidity and comorbidity sits in that.
That's fascinating, because that also has the implication, as you mentioned, the Mediterranean diet, that if it's much more kind of culturally appropriate, if you will, in terms of filling out those spaces, then that it doesn't solve, but it certainly makes a large contribution towards being able to speak to culturally competent conversations around nutrition, not trying to force, a Mediterranean diet into a culture which is unaccustomed to that of some, which is something that I've been seeing spoken about in equity circles quite often as well, that it's just replacing, the notion of a white diet into another white diet. While it might be healthier, it may not be the most culturally competent way to be able to progress those conversations around nutrition.
Absolutely. And if you talk about the UK just as an example for the Mediterranean diet is seen as an expensive diet that's for the socially, economically more higher, because it includes wine, it includes foods normally that most of our areas that are badly affected by poor liver health are lower socioeconomic areas, where if you only have 99p to feed a child, that is chicken and chips, because that's provided right outside the school. It is not your Mediterranean diet, but we would be looking to enhance the diet for that cost. So I think it's very difficult. Whilst I totally side with the Mediterranean style, it's the quality of diet in each of the, each community has their own way of establishing that. It's what are the parameters for that we need to establish.
Yeah, and I think we're still really kind of struggling to come to a terminology that wraps around that. What we're really talking about is steps away from ultra-processed, low density foods or, high calorie, low density foods that are otherwise malnutritious in some way, and trying to figure out though that descriptor that allows us to go forward in some way. Mediterranean diet has been convenient, but it isn't necessarily the way that's going to be best leveraged for different cultural conversations. Roger, let me get your thoughts to jump in on this as well. We've gotten into diet stuff a little bit here also, but I'm just curious about kind of the patient voice on this also. Where do you see that?
It's a great question, right? Because I think part of the fluency problem we're having here is that the real rules of diet aren't that complicated. People are only going to eat things that taste good, which is at the heart. So the question really becomes, can you give people simple building blocks that are healthy and help them turn those building blocks into things that taste good for them? Right. So every time, the Mediterranean diet is a good example of an opposite of that. As you say, in some places considered very expensive, in other places not what people eat. So we have to ask for each diet, what are the building blocks you can start with? And the other thing is to accept the idea that we don't expect ourselves to go from 0 to 100 in 3 seconds. Right. So how do we build increments of process? How do we take what we know about human behavior and how people succeed and build that into a sequential process on those building blocks that people eat what they like, and there are things that they like that are better for them than other things. And to me, that would be where the patient voice and all that would go. I've lost 100 pounds in my life, frankly. And those are the rules that helped me, and why I don't gain them back. So yeah,
that's so interesting. I mean, the notion of going from 0 to 300, as you say, I mean, it's the same thing with physical activity, isn't it? That so many people see it as a punishment, if you will, because you got to this position, you have to do this now, and not really appreciating sort of the different capacity. It's almost like it's a balloon. Everybody has a different capacity for which, it can hold. And so you don't necessarily need to go crank out a marathon the next day, but to slowly and consistently increase your capacity for building on that, as well as increasing your capacity for eating nutritious food as well. Jorn, I saw you unmuted.
Oh, you're right. I felt pressure to link in here and comment that, Louise and Roger mentioned important points that are patient-centric, but we got to also start about community or society-centric aspects. We got to start about, building urban green spaces. Let's say that. There has been analysis showing that if you don't have enough urban green spaces or you don't feel safe enough to go out in your neighborhood to exercise in the free, you are going to be more likely to accumulate metabolic risk factors. So even beyond the individual patient aspect, there's societal changes that need to happen. And I'm not talking the whole thing, talking to food industries and of course, how do we process foods these days? It's even how do we plan our cities? So the whole aspect of metabolic health is complex. There are certain goals the Sustainable Development Goals that have been defined by the WHO. And I think that's if you're asking me what's next, it's the patients, but it's also the community, the society. We have to talk about metabolic health, and right in the middle of that, liver health sits from my perspective.
I couldn't agree more with that, and it's fascinating, and it probably owes to my goof up on the German districts there, that from my last time in Frankfurt, Germany seemed so much further down the road in terms of things like pedestrian infrastructure, encouraging of walking space, encouraging of green space, higher density sort of models for living in closer communities, things that speak to this. And we have an initiative here in the U.S. called Vision Zero, which is trying to reduce, traffic fatalities for pedestrians. And often when you link up and you see that the areas, the high incident areas have really just been designed for cars, and you see how disproportionately it impacts the lower socioeconomic population groups, it's really remarkable. And that these are the same groups, same populations that are at risk for liver disease and chronic disease. And so to be able to address this in the same way that we talk about addressing obesity and many of the diabetes and the concurrent conditions, by addressing many of these social infrastructure issues, I think we'll be able to address this as well. Let me turn the knob here a little bit, and I want to talk about a point that was made during our diagnostic panel today. And recently, we had a patient-focused, or I guess at the end of last year, we had a patient-focused drug development symposium with the FDA here in the States. And one of the things that came out of it is wanting to help patients understand, or help the regulators understand, what was acceptable as a risk for patients. This guy, what's his name? Quentin Anstey, somebody you guys are familiar with, I think. Quentin, certainly, as someone who's leading the charge in many of these issues, Dr. Anstey's been really great. But one of the points that he made is he felt like the field often has let perfect be the enemy of the good in terms of what we were trying to achieve. Now, this was spoken specifically about kind of trying to create better non-invasives. And in the diagnostic area, Roger, let me go back to you. I saw you nod a little bit on that as well. What are your thoughts on Quentin's comment that we've often let perfect be the enemy of the good in NAFLD and NASH? You're muted.
I think I would describe myself as being in violent agreement with that statement. That, if you look at how markets develop, right? You get to a solution that's good enough, it gets distribution and marketing momentum behind it, and it becomes accepted. And we're not there. Where we are right now, for example, is we have a bunch of liquid tests scrambling for place in the market. We have a bunch of scanner or mechanically based tests, and then we have office-based things like VCTE. And right now, everybody's fighting for a piece of the pie without necessarily asking the smartest way to put the pie together. Okay, one of the things that Louise has educated me on and persuaded me is that the value of something like a Fibroscan, for example, might not lie purely in its therapeutic accuracy or diagnostic accuracy, but in the fact that when you show people something like that, that they react differently than if you simply give them a blood test result. Right. So we have to think about where is our technology good enough, and where can we, as good scientists, as Jordan points out, take the building blocks that we have now and start to build protocols that make sense. Now, some people with great products might not like that, but ultimately we can't have everyone fighting over which test to use. If you're going to get care pathways, you got to get patterns that everybody can use. And that's just consistent with market behavior.
Louise, you've been name dropped by Roger. I'm curious of your thoughts.
No, obviously I have left the NHS having spent 35 years looking at people at the end stage of their disease, or now getting to us for Fibroscans whereby we just send them straight back, which blocks our pathways. We cannot look after the patients with NASH if we are filling our pathways for the people who do not need to be in a liver centre. So basically, by giving everybody access to Fibroscan further down the market, or down the stream, upstream, I think it's called, we actually get a better way of screening out. But we also don't have to overly cause anxiety. If you were to be able to tell people 10 to 15, if not 20 years ahead of when they're going to have a heart attack, you could have a heart attack, why would we not want to know that information? Now, that's what we see with liver fat. We know that liver fat is a high risk of developing type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, strokes, hyperlipidemia, and blood pressure. But you have a device there, and there are other devices that do the same thing, that can pick out the populations at risk. But we're resistant to use it for some of the others. But Quentin's exactly right. If we only use it for kilopascals, for fibrosis, that's not what Fibroscan's designed to do. It's designed to get you to the right answer by telling you the ones at least risk. And since they added CAP, that just gives us a whole different opportunity. You can't talk about fatty liver disease if we don't talk about the levels of fat and just the levels of fibrosis. So I think it is the biopsy based on the enrichment of those populations that will tell us whether that patient has fibrosis that is equivalent to that CAP. And a kilopascal score, sorry. So I think let's use them for the right way, but let's use them to get to the right populations and education. I have yet to see somebody's behavior really not change when they know there's a risk. And when they're not a patient, there's less anxiety. The conversation starts about, what can I do about that? Oh, I didn't know that was a risk. How can I change it? But if you're in a medical pathway, your anxiety levels are that much higher. The minute we call you a patient, you have a structural of approaches that mean you have multiple appointments. You have multiple people giving you different messages, and that is really anxiety provoking. Mm-hmm. So let's take the anxiety out of it. Let's pick out the risks. Let's enrich the population who need to see hepatology. Let's enrich the population who need to go to cardiology and endocrinology for their assessments. So I think Quentin is right. We could just be looking for the perfect tool. We've got lots of good tools. Let's use them better.
That's fascinating, especially as it regards diagnostics and its implications for scaling diagnostics as well. Jorn, I'm coming to you with this now as our resident clinician on the board, if you will, our resident MD here. I'm curious if you feel like the field has let perfect be the enemy of the good, and if there are ways that you see that has happened that we are now transitioning away from, or perhaps ways that has happened that we are entrenched in.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I think taking a very academic perspective, I could say, first of all, it's important to talk about the context of use of the test. So you asked me about the referral pathways. There's a lot of patients. We want to rule out the patients that are not severely diseased. So I want a negative predictive value. And I think Quentin discusses this at length with all his expertise. You can take a test that's not able to identify patients with disease, but you can take a cheap test that has, a value in cutting down the population by, let's say, 2/3 because they do not need further follow-up. Of course, there's a better first-line test with better diagnostic modality or characteristics, but building this sequentially, as I mentioned, and I think there's just going to be 3 layers in most settings. The test doesn't have to be perfect for the first go around. And then the second thing I'd like to highlight in this aspect is that most patients, or let's put it another way, we can risk stratify good enough so that there is enough room for a patient, even if he's missed on first testing, we'll get him in year 3. Because liver disease are slowly progressive in most cases, and if you apply a test 2 times on the same patient, you increase the sensitivities dramatically. I would not want that in high-risk patients that are already cirrhotic and will, within 3 or 5 years, develop cancer or something. So that's where I bring in the clinical risk stratification. In the end, I think even with the tools we have today, we're ready to roll out those red carpets to treat and kind of funnel the patients. And so coming back to the theme of our recording here, what's next? I think what's really next is we got to apply these tests, which are not all perfect. We know about their test sensitivities, specificities, and so on, and we can use them and handle them and educate patients with them. And I think that's the most important. We got to get the momentum on the road now.
Roger, you're muted. Do you have questions or thoughts on that?
Actually, I thought I wasn't. I thought I unmuted. Okay, but that's fine. Yeah, I'm listening to you, and I'm hearkening back to something that Becky Taub said in her interview with Rachel at Fifth Global NASH, which is that this is a disease that was originally defined by a biopsy, right? Right. Which means the focus is on fibrosis, which is probably the wrong place for the focus to be initially, unless you're dealing with patients who are already in late-stage disease. Mm-hmm. So, the GRIP program, which I guess we spoke to Rick Roby at Fifth Global NASH, is about the idea of going straight from FIB4, whereas Jorn points out it's a good negative predictive test. You can rule a lot of patients out. Go directly to Fibroscan. Their theory was they wanted to find more patients for clinical trials. But 2 years ago, Ian Rowe came on our podcast and said if you analyze data in leads, you see the same thing, that they're supposed to go Fibroscan to ELF. FIB4 to ELF to Fibroscan, but he was finding that ELF had no practical value because if people didn't believe the ELF, they went on to the Fibroscan anyway. Right. And if they did believe the ELF, they probably had to go on to the Fibroscan anyway. So his question was, what's the most practical way to think about this from the disease in as compared to from the biopsy out? Back at Becky's comment. Yeah. And I think for patients don't think about biopsies except they hate them.
Yeah.
right? Patients think about the disease in a more holistic form.
Yeah.
So I think that would be a mental frame that might help in terms of patient centricity in general.
Louise?
Yeah, and I think when you were talking there, Roger, it takes me back to Lars Johansson when he says we try and measure something that's out of the liver currently rather than something that's in the liver. And I suppose MRE, Fibroscan, or any non-invasive modality where you're actually physically pulsating the liver some way is at least giving you an idea. I'd liken for me or for any of the physicians I used to deal with, if you took Fibroscan away now and did not have access to any of these non-invasive tools, how long would it take us to get to any disease solution or assessment of the liver? So it's like turning the light off in a room and asking you to find the door. It was the one thing that meant that you no longer had your finger in the wind to just, I'll have to wait for the liver tests. It was something that gave us an immediate result, and people responded very well to it. So for me, it's about that teaching moment, that opportunity where people's focus is entirely on themselves for once in an environment that's supportive. And I think it's very, very key for anybody, because the majority of people with poor liver health will never be patients until they either have a stroke or they have a heart attack or they develop type 2 diabetes, and one of the other conditions then relates it back. But we have knowledge now where and Maya Angelou said, if you know better, you do better. We now know better, and we are doing better, and we will do better. And I think that's the key about where we are now. And that's what, for me, International NASH Day drives, particularly in this sphere.
Oh, you tied that together very well. Thank you, Louise. It does seem to me that in the rise of non-invasives that we have seen, I agree with you, Roger, that because it's shifted the focus a little bit, and certainly has the potential of shifting the focus more from that biopsy-based, disease-centric into something that's a little different. I mean, when we talk about using non-invasives, especially early on, what we're really talking about is screening and staging the disease, if you will. So then it can be approached, in a more significant way where indeed biopsy may be an end result way down the road, but certainly not at the level it is right now. And one of the implications for that, though, is that it would allow for scaling, that you can't scale biopsies. There's no company in the world that's going to be able to do that. But you could scale, these non-invasive means throughout, communities in need and throughout the world, frankly, as well, to help identify what we already see as something with super high prevalence also. I want to hit one more thing before we go into our concluding remarks here for the day, the last little bit that we have here. And I want to talk a little bit about our hashtag this year, which was Stop NASH Now. And it was the phrase of which there was a lot of discussion around. And frankly, the phrase came from our discussions with the FDA around our patient-focused drug development meeting. And there was a feeling that so much of the drug development had been focused on reversal of fibrosis, on moving things back. But a lot of what we were hearing from the patients was, can we just stop NASH for a minute? Can we just put it on pause? Give the patients a little more time in what they're doing. I'm curious as your opinions on this, on kind of the notion of just kind of putting NASH and fatty liver disease on pause to give patients more time, as it exists kind of in the current clinical and drug approval environment, if you will. Now, that's a very broad question, but Jorn, let me ask you about that. Let you step up first.
Yeah, it exactly resonates what I'm discussing with my patients today when I tell him that we do not have an approved drug, but he might consider to start experimental therapy within a clinical trial, which, might not lead to resolution because I have no idea if the drug I'm telling him to sign on to could work, but it's something we're going to take care of you in a little more closer, a little bit more intense way than the primary care physician could do. And as such, we're going to delay his disease progression. At least that's my hope within the placebo arm, because I know there's certain placebo response rates. So I tell him we're going to put a brake on the NASH by enrolling him into a clinical trial and trying to just slow down the progression of the disease. I think in the future, I would hope that I use Stop NASH as when I fill a prescription and tell him to use a drug on top of his lifestyle changes and environmental changes he might go through. But at this point, it's a let's call it delayal strategy, trying to empower the patient through helping him temporarily by applying a drug potentially within a clinical trial, and stopping his disease progression. Because again, for most cases today, I think it's a progressive, but not rapidly progressive disease, and you want to take the fuel from the engine, or the boost from the engine a little bit.
Louise, let me go to you with this. Have you seen that shift? Is this a shift that's appropriate for the field?
Oh, I absolutely agree. And Manal Abdul-Mubarak talks a lot about stabilizing disease being an outcome rather than achieving reversal. I think from my perspective, I see a lot more people further upstream. So for me, Stop NASH Now is about find your F2s. And your plain fat with inflammation, or just people with too much steatosis. Because if you reverse the steatosis, you shouldn't get NASH. So for me, Stop NASH Now is finding that earlier population, so that we're attacking it from both ends. If we're treating the cirrhosis, if we're finding the F3s and F4s now by diagnostics, and also the ones who should never get there. Mm-hmm. I've moved far more to liver health, and I think it was interesting. Caitlin was discussing in the Australian, and it was really nice to see Australia at the table for International NASH Day. But they've gone more liver health rather than just Queensland hepatitis. So they look, and they've gone into the Indigenous Aboriginal population. So they're now more targeting liver health, because if you attack liver health, you shouldn't get liver damage, because you can reverse it, particularly in NAFLD and NASH, that much earlier. You can sort out the hepatitis B, you can sort out so by being sort of organ-centric rather than disease-centric, you will find the diseases if you look at the organ. And that, for me, is where I'm far more now. Most people, as I've said earlier, have poor liver health. They don't have liver disease, but those with poor liver health should never get liver disease, because we should find it.
And I think you mentioned this on the NASH Congress review episode with Roger just recently, as well, as this notion of talking more about liver health or liver wellness. And it got me thinking about where we're still wrapping our heads around, and we're doing a good job of it, I think, of kind of defining what liver disease is, even if we still have some fuzzy areas around F3 to F4, some of that sort of aspects that we're doing a good. We've got our indicators for that, but what our characteristics of liver health and liver wellness would be is something that hasn't been in the conversation as much. And I think it's something that patients would really resonate with. I mean, we know what a healthy heart is. We talk about that, and they've done a good job of promoting and discussing that. But to talk about a healthy liver, it would be interesting to see kind of where that could go. And it may be that the patient population is exactly the group that needs to be out there promoting and have that conversation. Roger, your thoughts on all that?
So I want to take a step back. Okay, first of all, to the rationale that Jorn started with about at this point in time, treading water or delaying might be a good enough strategy. At one point in my life, I found a lymph node full of melanoma in my neck, never on my skin, in my neck. And at that point, I very calmly turned around and said to my wife, so here's the deal. We have to keep me alive until the drugs catch up, which in fact we did. That was 12 years ago. I'm fine. This is not so different. If you look down the barrel, the drugs are coming. We should have one or two next year. With the next 3 or 4 years, we should have some drugs that can produce some fairly rapid responses. We simply have to get people to take care of themselves on the way there. And so I think Jorn's approach from the physician perspective is a really rational way to go after it. Now, run around to the other side of the table. Patients who want to learn how to be well, we need to give them better tools to do that. I think at that point, we're probably talking more about consumers in some ways than we are about patients, because if 25% of the adult population has fatty liver disease, those aren't all people in doctor's offices. A lot of those people never see doctor's offices. So we need to be able to communicate with them somehow as consumers so that they start to ask a question about, gee, should I get this checked out? Yeah, I know I'm a little overweight. Yeah, I know my blood sugar is a little high. Should I do something about this? Should I ask the questions my doctor isn't asking me? Mm-hmm. And I think those are the two, if you will, the two prongs that doctors who know working with patients on what Jörn called delayal strategies, which I think is a great word. And on the other hand, finding consumers who are willing to be triggered as they learn about themselves.
So there is a tradition on the NASH tsunami, Roger, of you going around to all of your panelists and asking them about something good in their lives, something that's positive that's happened, whether it's, Liverpool making it to the Champions League, or, Tottenham getting to a certain point, or, vacations had, et cetera, et cetera. Let me combine that by drawing to a conclusion here as well, to go around to each of you. And talk about something exciting, something interesting. Maybe it's a niche, maybe it's something that is just your particular area of interest, or maybe it's something that we are on the verge of impacting a huge number of the population with. What's something that has you excited, something that puts a little twinkle in your eye when we talk about NASH and approaching approaching fatty liver disease over the next year, over the next 5 years or so? Roger, I'll let you start.
I always finish. That's hard. But I'll start here. I think the increasing reliance on consortia and collaboration is huge. I think Jeff Lazarus was the first one who came on our podcast and said hepatology can't go this alone, but we're not. And when you look at Litmus and Nimble and now Nail NIT, you see efforts to aggregate large amounts of data and very, very, very smart people to ask basic questions in an agnostic way. The way we're starting to talk about combination therapy, the same thing. So I believe that if we all pull through this together, we will help a lot more patients a lot faster. And the fruits of that are only beginning to be seen in 2022. I believe that'll be an explosive area for excitement over the next 2 to 3 years.
Louise?
I suppose what I enjoy is why I left the NHS, is to everybody in the UK. It's one of the first countries that we know of can have a Fibroscan. They can have information really early to change a lifestyle, or just confirmation that the lifestyle that they've got isn't causing anything abnormal on a Fibroscan, because anything abnormal on a Fibroscan is a medical referral in any shape or form. And I think, but it is information. We didn't have blood pressure cuffs a few years ago. Now everybody has one at home who measures their blood pressure. There's nothing like measuring your blood pressure when you're stressed. So I think it is driving that out, because by driving that out, we're now cheaper than most NHS delivery systems to be able to obtain a scan. So that's what we want to do. We want to make this cheaper than a blood test eventually. And if that means that that gets my sparkle in my eye every time I see somebody whose lifestyle changes or who is aware of where their liver is. But we intend to do that as often as we can, and for as many reasons, from clinical trials all the way through. So that is exactly what I left the NHS for, to be able to upskill and provide diagnostics to people who need it, whether or not it's Fibroscan, whether it's other mechanisms, but also education, and deliver those pathways and design them. Because if we're not designing them now, we're not going to get them out when these medications come out. And there's so much work being done by Jean and Stephen Harrison and all of the others in getting these medications through these clinical trials. We need to be able to deliver them in the end. So we need to be designing those pathways now. So I've got a lot of twinkles.
Jorn, I'm going to stick with the surfing theme, as is common with the podcast, and ask you an Americanism of what brings the stoke for you these days in terms of the fatty liver disease and NASH field.
Yeah, I have 8 minutes, right? I could talk for a long time on this because, as Roger mentioned, there's really been an incremental gain in activities and knowledge. If you think back where we've been 3 years ago, I think it would have been unimaginable that we're talking today about not using liver biopsy in a regulatory trial as an approvable endpoint, and that's happening today. FDA suggests to have, next to your non-cirrhotic F2, F3 population trials, set up cirrhotic trials. Do not look at histology. Measure the benefit for a patient in terms of preventing progression to decompensating events. So I think there's so many things going on, and if I loop this back to GLI and think about what I would want to achieve together with GLI, then I would want to, in the realm of advocacy, see people stepping up, talking, having an outing moment, or do you host a disclosing moment, saying I have liver disease, from fatty liver disease, not from drinking, but from my type 2 diabetes. And if this is a Congress politician in the U.S., I would applaud you. And I think this is where we're heading and what we need, because we need to raise awareness, and we're on a good way for at least energy here to bring this forward.
Okay, I want to thank you guys for joining us. It's always a pleasure to join with the NASH Tsunami team to talk about stuff. And individually, it's always great to have these conversations. And so difficult, as I said earlier on, not to just kind of jump into some of these rabbit holes and completely tear them apart. There are so many great issues here for us to address and to keep working on. I want to thank the three of you and the team for being a part of International NASH Day, continuing to support liver patients worldwide and the battle against fatty liver disease and NASH. In conclusion here, I want to do something a little different, which is to make sure that people have heard what you say here. And so if they want to go and find more from you, Louise, we'll start with you, with Talbazun Health. If people want to find you, say, on Twitter or Instagram, or get more information or follow up with you, where can people find you?
Our website is www.talbazunhealth.com. It's a very medical side, but there is a lifestyle side with patient sort of caseloads. But I'm on LinkedIn, and it's Louise Campbell, and we're Talbazun H for Twitter. So we try and get out there, but or just contact me and have the conversation. If you need to look at different ways of delivering care and assessments, then more than happy to have those conversations.
Excellent. Jorn, how about you? Are you on Twitter, on the socials? Where can people follow up and find out more about what you're working with?
Sure. I'm just a physician, so you find me in my office. I'm based in Germany, and of course, I'm trying to be active on social media. So there's not too many Jorns out there. I'd be happy if you follow and are interested. I think one of my most eventful adventures in this field has really been the meeting we've set up in Barcelona, because I feel it carries a lot of what's discussed around NASH Day. And if you're interested, come join us next year, and be on the lookout for an interim webinar. We're planning maybe late November, early December, to propagate liver health and pull together all these stakeholders we need to provide good liver health and good liver care.
Excellent. Roger, you're the man with the podcast. Where can people find you and find your episodes?
Well, they can find the podcast at SurfingNASH.com, where we have every episode listed. We've got, at this point, over 135 hours of content over the last 2 years, which is really staggering when you think about it. But broken into episodes, and then we take the episodes and cut them into 10 to 15 minute snippets we call conversation, so that if you want to get a piece of something, you can find it that way. You can reach me by just doing questions at surfingnash.com or roger.green at hepdynamics.com. Hep, H-E-P is in liver, and then dynamics.com, which is my consulting firm, and that's the one that lives on my phone. Questions doesn't. The Twitter is rgreensurfnash, because I couldn't get Surfing Nash originally. We're trying to get it now. And I think that's everything that matters, Jeff. And thank you so much for having us. Speaking personally, it's a privilege and an honor to get to work with you folks. You've done fantastic work, and you've raised the visibility of this disease so much. You, Donna, everybody, to be commended every day.
We really appreciate that, Roger. We know we have taken important steps and there is still a long road to go. We often know in the stages of learning, you don't know what you don't know, and then you know what you don't know. I think we're somewhere in that area right now and beginning to continue to evolve, but we do it following the footsteps and with the support and with the leadership of folks like y'all as well. And we're thus putting a cap on a very successful NASH Day. You will have a NASH report. You'll be able to find these videos available online as well. We have had more endorsers, more supporters, more countries than ever before for this NASH Day in 2022. And we look forward to continued success. If you hear this and participated in any of our panels or seen any of it, please reach out to us. Don't forget to use hashtag NASH Day to share how you're raising awareness today on International NASH Day. And be sure to follow us on social media as well. That's at Global Liver on Twitter and Facebook, at Global Liver Institute on Instagram, and make sure you follow our website at internationalnashday.com. There's some hyphens in there, but you can also go to globalliver.org for more information. If you have any questions, feel free also to reach out to me, Jeff McIntyre at the Global Liver Institute. Thank you once again to our esteemed panel. Check them out weekly on Surfing the NASH Tsunami podcast, and we'll be sure to see you here again next year.